Thank you. I can hear Rick.
Pardon me, I'll go tell him.
Are we all still here? Okay, I didn't close this. Thank goodness. Okay. Um, Things flipped around and I've got about 100 tabs open just in case we're ready to go. I think we are broadcasting. I see it up in the top corner. And I'll wait for Verge to return and then we can open officially with all the things. Great. So thank you for joining us this afternoon. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge with respect that we are in Robinson Huron Treaty Territory, that the land on which we're gathered is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and known as Boateng. Boateng is the home of Garden River First Nation, Batchewana First Nation, and the historic Sault Ste. Marie Métis Council. I don't I added this to the agenda, item 2, declaration of pecuniary interest. I don't think that this really applies, but I wanted to make sure that it was out there just in case for transparency. So if anybody has anything to indicate, please do so now. And moving on to option number 3, the adoption of the agenda. Can I have a mover, please? Okay, and the seconder, I guess that will be Brenna, if that's okay. Thank you. Great. So we can move onwards to business arising, which is the Arts and Culture Assistance Program Guideline Review. As previously mentioned, I was going to say that Brenna has provided a really comprehensive review of the process, which I very much appreciate. I've circulated it over to Miranda. Virginia, I can't remember if you have I know that you have a hard copy. Do you have an electronic copy? Would you prefer that? I can flip it quickly.
No, I have the hard copy here. If we're
Great.
going through, we just need to bring it up on the screen to share.
Sure. And I will do that immediately. That's one of my tabs. So one moment, please. Okay, and please let me know if you can see it.
Yep, perfect.
Great, fantastic, thank you. And move this over here. Okay, great. Great. Where would we like to start, I guess is the question. Officially here, again, like this is all comprehensive of the guideline review, so it's good to go. Brenna, would you like to start by any chance?
Yeah, it's kind of just a spewing of my ideas onto paper. So there are a lot of errors, written errors and grammar errors within. I write delegate instead of deliberate a few times. So we'll just take the document with a little bit of grace and hope that we can look past those.
Absolutely.
But it was just kind of a process that I thought might be applicable to what we're trying to achieve with the arts and culture program. So I looked over the details and tried to create a bit of a comprehensive document so that I could document my understanding through the process and kind of review some of the things that we've kind of been having some difficulty on while reviewing some of the applications. So I'm very open to feedback in terms of whether it's practical, feasible, and if this proposal is something that we can look forward to integrating. So if we have any feedback in any way, we can walk through it. This is the existing procedure that we have for the arts and culture program with the first phase of intake, the second phase of intake, and the procedure for applicants.
Yes. Thank you for putting this together. Like, thank you so much again. I was going to say, moving on to page 2. This was really interesting to me. I appreciate this. It's clear. I like it. My biggest concern well, this is that at some point that we will have to put it into words to make sure that it's AODA accessible for a current website, but that's not an issue. That's something we can obviously do. But I really like how this is laid out. It's really interesting to me, and I think it's clear.
What I really appreciate about this, being as how this is a program for creative folks who may be quite predisposed to being visual learners, like myself, this takes the words and the jumble off the page and puts it into a much more easily followable diagram map. Um, and it's colorful and it's, you know, a little bit softer in its approach. Even though some of the formal language is still there, it's just a lot more accessible, I feel.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a nice summary so that it helps guide through that process. Um, and I think there's two ways, like to what Alicia was saying, just from like AODA requirements we have on the website. This is something that can easily be a handout to applicants. So that when they get their package or they're inquiring, we could send it out via that format. And then if somebody does request something that's AODA compliant, then we have it in a Word version for them as well. So I think having multiple tools like this is really beneficial to supporting the applicants.
Agreed. One of my biggest concerns right now with the way that the documents are set up for the process is the fact that there's a lot, there. There's a lot of content, lots of material, and a lot of it is just typed out on pages. So it can feel visually daunting. If there are ways to streamline that and soften it the way that this diagram does, and I can only imagine that there's more in this document about making the language more succinct. I think that those are measures and measures we can take that will just make the whole process a lot more approachable, which is the whole purpose.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, when we have to write a lot of these documents, we have to write it because you're covering off legal and finance and all of those areas. And then it is a lot the way that it's laid out. So even if there's ways to simplify, okay, you're applying for a project grant, here's a one pager, and you're applying for this grant, here's everything you need to know, then it'll help just make it a lot more succinct for those applicants.
Yeah, definitely. There's definitely something very welcoming about this too. Like I said, just a clarity. And I mean, being that I'm very heavily involved with reviewing the guidelines and knowing what the information that's within. Virg, I guess the question is I know that we have to have kind of like an overarching guiding document, as we already have. Once if we modify that, are we allowed to have other breakout pieces like this that reiterate again like the same thing in software language as long as it is in alignment with that in other document? Or again, is that okay? Or is that something that would also have to be approved by council?
Um, if we're pulling pieces from the original approved document and reorganizing them just so that it makes it simpler for a nonprofit that's applying to a large project grant or an individual that's applying to seed funding, we can have just the information that they need on one pagers or a smaller handout, because we're just taking pieces of the policy and helping guide them through what they need to know for their grant application. So yeah, we can easily extract that and put those into additional pieces without requiring council approval, because we're not changing the guidelines.
Awesome. Okay, perfect. That's good to know. I'm just going to flip down. Sorry, I moved here first, but ultimately this talks about the intake timelines. Let's continue through the document and then kind of circle back about the process as it is. See here, that's a beautiful capture of ACAP history from fall 2023 in spring. And yeah, it's like that's again like relatively recent, which is great. Sorry, 2024, I see. I was going to say that no, this is a really nice breakdown to have as well. This is something that we were also working on internally, having accessible. I wonder, I'm going to ask, is there any requirement to have this information posted outside of council minutes? as well. I'm just trying to think about other opportunities for advertising the program and recipients. It's a little
We can add,
offline.
yeah, sorry, no, we can have that added to the website, so we could have sections to show the successful applicants.
Okay.
So that's easily added to the website.
Yeah, and just to add, in other places where I have seen results publicly posted, typically the non-funded applications don't get posted out of respect for the privacy of those applicants.
Yes. Thank you. Yes, of course. Okay, moving down.
I have a note here that living history Algoma needs to be switched with another. Part of this proposal is a knowledge translation for the existing guidelines, and then part of it is trying to figure out where we're missing programs, either consistently or people who are applying for funding and missing out on a regular basis. So that's so part of it is part of a bit of a proposal, and then part of it is just trying to look at our weak points and our pain points, and the fact that we don't get to fund everyone, and the amount of applications that we really do get to fund, I don't think we have enough funding to give out. So part of the application is a bit of a knowledge translation for the system, and then part of the application is a bit of a proposal to show that we have a need. So those aspects I wouldn't say needed to be public, but the knowledge translation stuff and the all that detail would be really great to offer.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. So yeah, so here's the breakdown.
Right. So if we were to evenly distribute the funds over both intakes, and distribute them, those would be our limits as to how many applications of different levels we would be able to fund and how much we would be able to fund them. It would also show that we would have to stack grants to be able to get applicants to the point where they can get operating grants or seed grants. So per term, we may only be limited to like $3,000-$5,000 grants, which is a little bit low in terms of the types of programs that we're funding and how much they contribute and impact the community. So that's what we have the availability to give right now if we look ahead of time. If we had an influx of 46,000 a year, we would be able to do what we would do the first term, both terms. So the amount of programs we could fund with that 75, if we could get it to 75 both terms, then I think we'd be making a real impact in being able to sustain and influence these and keep these programs alive that have kind of contributed to tourism development and the fabric of our community.
Hey, Virg, can we talk at all about budget process and like the process that we go to for funding for next year? I'm sorry, I don't have the best verbiage on this, but can I ask you to speak to it, do you think?
Yeah,
About how that
absolutely.
works? Okay.
So last year and again this year, we've put in a request for increased funding for arts and culture. So this year's request went in at 160,000. That would be divided out between support through the ACAP program, as well as some additional funding for heritage, and then additional public art funding. So that would increase the pot if approved. So we'll know during budget deliberations if that request moves forward for the 2025 budget, or if we'll have to resubmit again in another year.
And historically, we've been asking for that increase for a couple of years, right?
Yes, so the original pot that was available was 53.9. That was increased to 75, and then it was increased again to the $104,000 with some funding, 40,000 that's allocated to public art pieces. So we have seen, close to $100,000 in increased funding over the past number of years, which has been great for arts and culture in the community. So again, it's just trying to get up to that level so that we can continue to support the number of applicants that we're seeing.
I see here a note about sorry, I'm looking. Oh, I'm so sorry. Here we are. Looking at this page. So there's a note here about the $46,000 to be redirected from the Tourism Development Fund. So finding out more about how the organization works. Again, that money isn't something I think that we can ask for. Although I would love to. But I was going to say, so Ferg, if you could speak to that too, because again, this is a conversation in the Fast Week as well about how funding works.
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to the TDF. Some of the funding that's received through tourism. So tourism has different avenues, and I can do some more clarification, but they do receive funds through the MAT tax, which is the municipal administration tax that comes from the hoteliers. So there's a percentage, and then those funds are allocated and used towards projects that help bring in tourism. So the TDF, I believe, funds from that program go into the TDF to support any applications that come through that will continue to bring tourism to the community. And those applications are assessed by the tourism board.
Oh, Brenda, go ahead, please.
I recently learned that the Sudbury process takes the ACAP board and the tourism board and puts them together and allows them to develop their fund out of both. So it's a jury of 18. Then the arts and culture, depending on how many applications they get, they're able to look at the economic development fund that has streams for celebrations, cultures, social equity, and sustaining. And then they're able to fund the ones that require the funding as opposed to being limited. So I understand that they have a lot more funding than us. So they gave away probably like 23 applications, but 13 seems more aligned with what we're looking at. But being able to at least fund those 13, there is a conversation where the arts and culture is not redirected from the economic development fund, but considered alongside rather than budgeted out, if that makes sense. So I was just wondering, I understand the overlap with the tourism development fund and the hoteliers, but I do believe that Sioux Theater Workshop and the Algoma Conservatory of Music and a lot of other programs are contributing to the fabric of that tourism network. And I don't think that the applicants that are being sent to ACAP are kind of being shorthanded, in my opinion. But that's just my opinion. So I understand that there's limits. However, that economic development fund is something that I believe that these applicants should have more access to. And that's just my opinion.
That's really interesting. I don't disagree with you. I was going to say that I would love for that opportunity as well. I wonder then if that's a matter of connecting with tourism, because again, they have like their own metrics that they go through in their own process. If I'm being honest, through a conversation, when applicants talk to me, whenever I can, I pass them that way. Whenever I think that there's an opportunity for growth and development, in particular, if they're looking at annual events and if they're looking to bring people in from the city. So I think one of the major metrics I know that they look at there is specifically people who are coming in town for a specific event. So if you can somehow count and get a number on that. But anyway, sorry, I digress a bit. I didn't mean to go there. But it's interesting for sure.
No, I agree. There's always arguments to be made for either side.
I can also reach out to Atlanta and tourism to find out how many cultural events have been funded and how much money's been allocated, right? Because I know that they support Bonsu, Queen Street Cruise. There's another of festivals and events in the community that are supported through that pot, which means those applicants haven't been coming to look for funding from ACAP. So, when you're kind of combining the amount of funding that's going out for festivals, events, and arts and culture activities, it'll give us a picture of how much money was, put into those areas in the community when we look at the combined support.
Right, because I did provide something from the Tourism Development Fund that was approved at council. There were screenshots from the council agenda. And it shows which programs were funded by ACAP and which programs were funded by the Tourism Development Fund applications within the year. And I understand that the Bush Plain Heritage was a consultant for a program. And a lot of these might have opportunities to find funding federally, but we have institutions like Fringe that need to bypass city funding for some reason, and aren't getting a bigger chunk of that tourism development fund. So it may be just a requirement to overlap and understand, like, the recreation, tourism, and arts and culture share similar outcomes. But that's just my perspective.
I love that you brought this forward. I'm not gonna lie to you. Awesome. Okay. Let's keep going if that's okay. This is like all really valid and really relevant. Let's moving on to, I was gonna say, so we've got some ACAP history here, kind of going back in what we discussed just now. Again, like where this was this year, early and late intake, and then some suggested rubric adjustments. So I was going to say that if you care to speak to this, Brenna, that would be great. Otherwise, I can read. But I was going to say, but if you'd like to share, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, a lot of the from the perspective of the applicant, I find that whether you're an individual, group, nonprofit, or incorporated nonprofit is really where you fall in terms of how much you can apply for, whether it's celebrations or cultural diversity grants. So I figured if each project was established based on like their EDI outcomes, they would have those scores internally, and they wouldn't have to only apply for one stream. It could actually be considered as like outside of just being a cultural event, but still show that cultural impact and the impact on the certain groups that we want to make sure that we promote their voices and their programs.
Yes, I think we've run into this. But maybe we can speak a little bit more to it just about through our last ACAP process in particular, looking at some of the applications. Forgive me, I can't remember if it was early or late intake this time. But there were a couple for sure in both intakes that were kind of mid-range in terms of the way that the applications are written and ultimately didn't make it through for funding, but would have scored very highly with an associated EDI internal score prior to that. So I think it's very important that we include this moving forward for sure. I think this helps to change and level the playing field pretty significantly, actually.
Yeah, I think it's created some difficulty in as a scorer to isolate things in that way and want to apply it to every program, because most of the programs do have a level of EDI in their community impact.
Excellent. And then here we have some suggested application adjustments.
Right, so this goes along with the individual's perspective when they look at themselves as, am I an individual, or are we a group, or are we non-incorporated or incorporated? And then applying for whether you're a large project, whether you're a major celebration, whether you're a cult, and whether you're looking for operating funds, and being able to apply for more than one stream. So you can take your application and say, oh, here's the project. It's based on this amount of funding. I'm asking for this amount of funding. And it's because of these different streams where I fit. And then we evaluate based on those different streams. I think there's a flow chart in the next slide, or, oh yeah, that's at the end.
Here.
Oh. Yeah,
Oh, is this here?
that one. Sorry.
This one?
That one is the kind of, from the applicant perspective, if you were to choose your eligibility, you're non-incorporated or incorporated, are you an individual or group? Are you kind of newer or established? And then it kind of shows based on your project what streams you would be able to apply for. And they could make an effort to stack funds or apply for multiple funds, but we would be establishing funding based on the outcomes. So we would have 5 at 2,000, 4 at 349, 3 at 5,000, 3 at 5,000. Now, if we have 6 at 5,000, we can still make the decision to award 10,000. It just takes up 2 of those spots. So people can make a plea to have more. However, we set ourselves at a standard that we will be funding 12, 15 projects each term, and then going from there. And I think it makes it a little bit easier for the applicant to apply for the project specifically, because sometimes it's hard for me to establish like feasibility and then also know that can't deliver on the funding, or if the asks are too large, you know. So having the amount of outcome set in a way that shows that it's like, this is going to cover 80%, or this is where the money's going for this or whatever, makes it a little bit easier to assess that on the rubric scale for me personally. So that's the way that I kind of looked at it as an applicant.
So just to clarify, we wouldn't necessarily be saying that we will fund 15 projects, because there is the possibility of stacking. So it would be up to 15 projects, right?
Right. And we would then be given the decision to delegate over awards and stacking awards. So going beyond that, whether it's a particular need at a particular time, or an application that we think is really strong for merchandise or materials, things like that, then we can easily deem the project worth even up to like 4 or 5 stacking of streams. But that would be a decision that we would be faced with making.
What are your thoughts just on the possibility of removing stacking, where you just pick one stream and you put your application in for that?
I think it would be a lot easier at this level, especially because if we go to the next slide, most of the upper level programs can apply for multiple streams elsewhere. So if we want to limit the support to smaller funds that focused on artists and entrepreneurial and group volunteer practices, and we want to use the ACAP fund to grow them to the point where they can access all of our other city funding, that would be fantastic. So it would ideally work that way, but at this time, there are certain applications that we get that I think that we can argue need the stacking for their programming and don't always have too many external options. A couple grand isn't too much, 5 grand isn't too much.
If not.
Like that's why I'm like, it would be nice to take away the stacking, but we need to ensure that everyone has the support from other funding and is getting it. So when those applications go to tourism, we need to know that if they're able and eligible, that they should be considered in that area before this smaller fund. Does that make sense? I would say that we could limit it to the smaller amounts if we could guarantee that places like the Algoma Conservatory of Music and the Sioux Symphony Orchestra and Living History Algoma and the Heritage Department are getting their funding from other streams. But right now, they don't seem to be getting successful funding from other streams. And then they're left with large asks for ACAP. And it becomes very difficult to underfund them.
Mhm.
You just summarized like all of it. Like you're right. Like that's exactly it. That's interesting. I'm going to move forward into the next piece here. So what you're calling for in this proposal is a $46,000 supplement, in addition to what's already there, of course. Really vetted application system. So do you see more staff, just out of curiosity? Like, and this is very open, and I'm very open to all the things, just so you know. But I was going to say, do you see like significant staff review prior to it getting to the committee members? I think that's I think it's probably part of it. But what are your thoughts? I don't want to like speak too much.
I think you can send them out like if you go to the one slide that was in the wrong order that came right after that other one with the process.
Is this the one? Sorry.
Yeah, that one.
Okay.
So they'd supply their application. We would do the scoring as a group. So the staff would be responsible for making sure that it's either a complete or fulsome application at that point. And it would still be the same considerations. And then they would go to the evaluation, and when those scores are put together, they would be shortlisted. And the deliberations would come afterwards. But since the scoring would be a little bit more accurate, it would be easy to, like, let's just say there's 5 in a category, to deliberate the top 8. Or to deliberate the top +3 when each funding category.
Mhm.
Because then it also, after you do the scoring and you cut it down to that short list, it offered them an opportunity to make a plea. So if they need stacking or if they need anything like that, that's their opportunity. So that would be the second follow-up from staff, is that, okay, these shortlisted applicants have been suggested, you have an opportunity to make a plea for your funding or speak to the count or whatever it is, and kind of leave it on them to submit documents if they want to. And then the review process is kind of similar to that final review process where we really decide how much money is going where. So it doesn't give as much opportunity to deliberate scores. However, within the rubric, I really do think that we might be able to get down to a proper shortlist across all of our committee members and their scores. So that's the only part that might need to be looked into, is that shortlist aspect where we don't necessarily deliberate scores, but we choose the top and then deliberate those. So that's where I anticipate there being a problem, but it gives people an opportunity to make a plea, to show that to speak, as opposed to putting it on staff to collect and answer those questions and collect it. They're given the opportunity to just give a blank statement kind of as to why they should get the funding. And it is kind of like an award system or a competition. But on a smaller level, it might make it easier for people to get a little bit of headway if they've been applying for year after year after year after year. So from that perspective, I'm not sure whether it puts more on staff or puts more on the applicants.
I'm not sure either. I was going to say that looking at this, it's really comprehensive. It's really interesting. don't have any like objections to any part of what's been proposed. My biggest concern is just timelines. What it always comes down to is timelines and availability and for everybody else. And so even with this outlined properly for ACAP committee members, it's about their inclusion and about making sure that they've had the ability to review and process things. And so I just wonder. Oh, sorry. Please go ahead, Miranda.
Finish your thought. I'm just going to be asking
Okay.
some clarifying questions to make sure I'm on the same page.
Okay. I'm trying to figure it out too. I think this is one of those things that I need to sleep on overnight to come back with more thoughts, because it's a lot and it's really comprehensive. Um, but I just want to make sure that we're doing justice to all parts of it. There are some pieces in this proposal that are really succinct and really right on the nose. There are other parts that we will have like less control over with like the TDF and the amount of funding that we have. And so I think what we're going to need to do is to take a look at this and to kind of pare it down and figure out what is possible with the timeline that we currently are on being closer to the end of August, and when we want to start the process, and then making sure that we can send it through the committee and through council for review and approval, and then to get it in place. And of course, we'd like to do this properly so that there's no issue with, well, last year, like, so this being last year, in 2024, it was this way, but in 2025, it changes to be in alignment with where it should actually be. So I'm just trying to I'm like thinking very administratively about this piece. But please go ahead, Miranda. Sorry.
So my two clarifying questions at this point, Brenna, just to make sure that I'm on the same page. In this proposal, budget increases notwithstanding, what I hear you saying is that you are advocating for all or nothing funding as opposed to funding on a percentage of the ask, so that we can kind of plan on the number of sort of up to 15 project kind of a thing. And also looking at this procedure proposal, the application goes in, city staff evaluate the project's impact, and then city staff review the scoring. And then there's a smaller review panel made up of CVC members that meet and look at things before it goes to the CVC entirely. Am I reading that correctly? Thank you.
It may not be clear in the document, so that makes sense. It would be the same way that we do the scoring initially on our own. So it wouldn't be staff who's looking over the initial and shortlisting. It would be that same number system, rubric system that we use. However, the threshold will kind of be decided for us to deliberate on projects that we can actually meet funding
And
for.
that threshold is where the short list comes in then, yeah?
Right. So rather than deliberating a threshold at the end, it would be making a short list at the start and still including, like, the CVC would still be a major part of that. The staff would just be delegating what decisions have been made, adding the scores, choosing the finals, letting us know. We would have an opportunity to come back and go, what about what happened here? I don't understand. But shortlisted applicants would then be deliberated again by the CVC. So it would be using the initial scores from the rubrics from the CVC to then make a short list, which then we deliberate funding. So essentially the threshold is decided before we get to the deliberations, where oftentimes we don't know the set threshold based on what applications we get. And it's something that comes complicated. And the last time we did it, we decided to do 5,000 each one. And I don't necessarily look at it as all or nothing funding, but because we fund so few in the method we have right now, it actually allows us to fund more programs and more viable things.
Well, and it gives the applicants a clear expectation too of what the max amounts are, as opposed to going big and then just getting a small sliver.
Right, and then them having to adjust their plans or program as well. You know, it kind of, yeah, in that feasibility structure for our rubrics will be more accurate that way, I think.
And I see efficiencies in the review process in all of this with regard to setting the threshold and also shortlisting. So the amount of information that goes out to CVC members for the deliberation is smaller and also more clarified. Thank you so much for clarifying that for me and for laying this out so comprehensively.
No, thank you. It's a bit of a brain vomit onto paper, so I really need some help to make it understandable. So I'm like, yeah, it might not make sense. This is but I'm glad that we can work through it and get it to a point where it does, because there are a bunch of different angles and a bunch of different information here, and it's going to really be pick what works and drop what doesn't, and what we can do and what's even possible, right?
Regardless of whether there is an infusion of extra budget, wherever that comes from, I think that it may be worth having more conversation about this process with the pot that's currently available for ACAP as well. Just as far as finding efficiencies within the process that we have been chatting about and struggling with as a committee.
Speaking of which, so I don't know, I don't think that this was touched upon, but did we talk about changing? I thought you mentioned maybe one intake at one point. I know that, is that true? I'm having a moment where I can't remember. Sorry.
I did, I've always done the two, but I did the existing funds that we have. I think it's in there, there. So instead of doing 78 and 25, because we put in the same amount of work for the applicants and the applicants put in the same amount of work, we would have to spread our existing pot of 104 across both intakes, which would only give us 52. Which would put us more in line with what we were able to fund the last time, which was fairly low compared to what we were doing. So, yeah, so we would, if we adapted the process but didn't get an influx of budget, that's where we would be. And that's how many programs we'd still be able to fund, just at lower amounts, I think.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just thinking for our timing, right? Do we add some guidance in there that if you're applying for, say, early intake, we know we're probably not going to have a decision till sometime in January. So if you have projects that are taking place from, starting in March onwards, you might apply to early intake. Whereas if you're doing late intake, you may be looking at your projects that are taking place from September through to March of the next year. So there's no reason that they can't carry their funding in. It just gives them that buffer so that they maybe know a couple months in advance. Because what's happening, I think, now is everybody's putting into that first intake. And, I think just giving maybe guidance. Operating's operating, they can apply whenever they like. But the others, it just gives them guidance on when there are events happening or whatever, because we seem to be behind the 8 ball when they're making those applications and we're getting the decisions to them.
Right, like suggested start dates for projects and things that follow along that realm, where it's like it should, like, not their suggested project date, but kind of give a guideline of a suggested project date.
Yeah, I think that may help some of them a little bit, because, and the initial thought process was kind of going back some time ago, and Miranda probably remembers, we had one intake and we would end up missing applicants that maybe had something, oh, I have this opportunity, they found out in April, and we had no avenue or means to support anybody that didn't know, well in advance. So that's when the two intake timeframes kind of came into place, so that we could maybe be more responsive to something that came up in the new year or later in the previous year.
I think, Virginia, what you're suggesting around date timeframes and providing those is really good, really sound advice. I think we should do that. I also just want to advocate for the 2 streams instead of going to, or not the 2 streams, the 2 intakes instead of going back to 1, particularly as pressures continue to mount economically. I think that it's really nice to know that there are 2 intakes so that if you miss the first one, you can apply for the second one. And that there are like the waiting time in between applications is not so great. Even just having that, I think, can lessen like the mental burden a little bit on practitioners and on organizations.
In addition to that, I also think that dividing the pot, I'm sorry, the way that we're looking at on the screen right now, like at a 52 and a 52, I don't love the 70-30 split ish. I was going to say that I think that that adds a layer of competition into the second part of the year as well. Like it's not competition isn't bad, but the point is that it heightens the need basically and the level at which we deal with our applicants with as well. And there is always disappointment when people have missed the first intake. So again, two intakes I'm very much in favor of. But I don't like the current split. If we could address that, I appreciate that.
I feel like we did that at one point, or there might have been conversation about, and maybe I'm just totally missing the mark here, about assuming that there might be extra funding available after the first intake was over. That would
Sorry.
second intake, but it's been proven through the last several intakes that we just don't have enough. And so maybe it makes sense for us now to start dividing it 50-50 and offering consistently twice a year.
Sorry.
I think
No, I was just going to say, and I think, I think that it could be helpful. I think it was just kind of a first kind of, let's see how this works. And, we now have lots of feedback from committee members. So I think it's time to do a bit of an update. Those types of changes are ones that the policy does have to get updated and brought to council. So that would be something that would be presented as a change.
It feels good to be able to have those conversations, those like incremental adjustment conversations now that we have more experience with these guidelines, that we've got proven results and we have data to back up the conversations that we're having. And yeah, no slight at all to where we started, but we're learning together, and it feels really nice to be able to adjust together too.
Yeah, agreed.
Oh, so what I'm hearing from today, I'm not trying to rush us out by any means because I still feel like we've actually got quite a bit more to talk about. But again, we're seeing some I've got so many notes here. Maybe I can't even say this right now, but I was going to say that reasonably speaking, I think my concern is just the timeline in terms of the application process. And not for this intake. I mean, of course, we want to make sure that we're serving our community as best we can and not rushing the process. Typically, we have opened up the process in since I've been with this program, typically about a month or so before it closes. So I typically try in about 35 to 40 days. And often I do take calls throughout the year and we discuss, and so it's not limited to that time frame. But ultimately, in terms of just literally taking in the applications, people start looking for them in the middle of September, maybe sometimes before, but they usually get in touch with me as well, which is fine. I guess my concern is I think something that I've noticed is not working for the committee, and it might just be the preference of committee members or the time of year, or even just people's jobs in their fiscal year and the things that we all deal with in different ways. I feel like I'm concerned about the intake deadlines because then where that shifts the work to and the requirements. So typically by closing at the end of October, we're seeing those applications in the middle to end of November and often spilling into December, which a lot of people then start to have conflicts with seasonal responsibilities. And I find that to be the same in April. So is there any ability to shift this earlier or later? Where does that make sense in this conversation, if at all? And if anybody has any thoughts, I would love to hear them.
What would you suggest based on the experience that you've had, what works best for it, like organizations and things like what would be a better time where they have the ability to put the effort into this application, and we can always switch to 6 months from then.
I have concerns about conflicting deadlines in like late October, early November with OAC. There seems to be a looming November 7th deadline all the time. If that makes sense, for Northern Arts projects that people are often reviewing and in competition with. And so this is a good process for them to go through and get these applications going. And then it's, again, like reiterating those numbers and those projects to OAC. But I don't know. In terms of that, I certainly don't mind administratively being on the end of this in November, December. There's room for that. There's room for adjustment there. But I also know that if we're looking at fiscal calendars, though, too, many nonprofit groups are on a fiscal calendar, and not an annual calendar, so to speak. And with that in mind, I don't know, because not every organization is the same. If they were more standard across the board, that would make sense. But because we often then are looking at financials when people close their their fiscal year at the end of March, and then they have a nonprofit group, they have an accountant do things for them at a nonprofit rate. They're often looking in the off season, so those financials are often not available until much later. So that's kind of a conversation that keeps coming up separately, but not directly at ACAP review. Sorry, Miranda, you have a question or something?
Just saying, regardless of all things, there's always a deadline.
Yeah.
So, like, thinking about OAC programs, for example, because it's surfaced a few times in this conversation, there are deadlines for different programs all the time, and regardless of where we're scheduling the deadline for, somebody's going to be in conflict. I think that your instinct around what seems to be the favored fiscal year, which is April 1st to March 31st, might be good to try to wind around that, just so that we're not hitting people with application deadlines around year end or around scramble times. But in our particular case, what if the application deadlines were moved like a month backwards? So right now it's late October, early November, and then you said, remind me.
I don't remember. I'm sorry.
October 31st and end of March.
Oh, sorry. I thought you were asking what I had said.
So
Forgive
like,
me.
Oh, sorry.
If we were to shift it to the end of September and the end of February, as deadlines instead, what would that look like? I see Brenna's got a question or a.
Sorry, I'm just gonna chime in on that. If it's moved to the end of September, when would you anticipate the committee would be making decisions by?
I think that puts us on the same trajectory as we are now, though, to be perfectly honest.
So still in January?
I still see, no, I hope that we would hopefully have it done by December 1st. But with the season the way that it is, I don't know that that's entirely helpful.
Yeah, the reason we had, and this is just kind of background, selected October 31st as the deadline is that those applications would be coming in, there'd be some compiling going on, and then budget deliberations. So we would never know about our increases until December. So that allowed time to make an adjustment if the additional funding came through at that point in time, because then you would know. So if you bump it back, you'd be kind of making decisions, not knowing if you're getting that extra funding.
Thank you for that insight.
Here's a question. And this is actually, I wrote this down before you said that, Verge, but like, and I don't want to push for this because especially if it's not reasonable, but January and June, the end of January, or like the beginning, like open in the beginning of January, close at the end of January or early February, deliberate and have that information out. Because by that point, most groups with financials should have them or should have a semblance of something that they can share with us. And then if we're not adhering to a calendar year, like then we're in alignment there. It's shortchanging people a couple of months though this year is my concern. But we'll have a long runway leading up to it. And we should know the increases by January, if there are any?
We would know in December. My concern with June is it will be very, very difficult to get committee members together to do those deliberations in June and July into August.
No, you're right. Sorry.
So June is June is extremely busy for rec and culture and a lot of other people. It gets to be very, very event heavy. I just think it would be a real struggle to get the committee members together to do that type of work during that time frame. I guess the concern is if we are pushing it back, any of those individuals that would apply for January, February, March, April funding for any programs in that first part are going to miss out, and those date changes have to be approved by council.
In theory, though, I don't know. I'm good to not debate this. But I was going to say that in theory, some of our applicants have already applied for funding and for programming that happens so they already know that. So like they've already, like, for example, I'm thinking Sioux Blue Society have already applied for programming that extends into January, February of next year. And we have allowed for that with other applications as well. So I'm with you. Like I said, I don't want to shortchange anybody the opportunity, but at the same time, and I absolutely see what you're saying with June. I get it. And even to push that to May is not better. I would just like to not live in a perpetual state of ACAP, which is what this entire year has been.
What's wrong with you? Where's your sense of adventure?
Well, I think it's no matter what, with 2 intakes, it's going to have that impact, right? I guess I just worry if you start to push it too far into, because we were already struggling in May with all of those meetings.
You're right.
In June, I just worry if you push it further, then it's really going to have an impact and it's going to be very difficult to get quorum.
You're not wrong. I'm just trying to think through it to make sure, because I don't want to miss the opportunity to make it better. And to live with something that's like not working as well. I want it to work perfectly, but that's not realistic. Does anybody?
What if we stagger changes? So like obviously the deadlines are something that are important to consider, but what we're talking about here is like a process shift and then potentially a deadline shift. Maybe we do these changes incrementally and see how they shake out in real time, and we start with some of the process changes that have been suggested and then like just take it at a chunk at once. Because what Virginia's saying makes a lot of sense to me and also kind of blows my mind. 2 mind boggling one day.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Brenna.
Yeah, I was just thinking to make things clearer. It's not early intake or late intake. It would be you apply in the spring for the fall events and you apply in the fall for spring events, and make it very clear so that there's an understanding there. But I think the priority would be to figure out how to get council to approve the split as opposed to the 70-30 or the 80-20, whatever we have there. I think that might be our first step, is to figure out how, like, to get the approval to do half and half.
And I would, I don't perceive that as an issue. The CVC committee is the committee that has the most experience with it. So I think in that case, it's just it's a minor change. It's not, that significant, and they would defer to the expertise that we have in the CVC committee in that report. So I don't perceive that that's an issue, but, to Miranda's point, I do think that maybe making some of these changes in process may help streamline it and reduce the number of meetings and the burden on the CVC committee. So that would give us a better idea, once we see the impacts of those changes, what maybe needs to happen timeline wise. And it could be also surveying you know, a lot of those applicants and committee members to get some of their feedback on, you know, how are the timelines working for them, right? And what's that impact to their events? And, you know, if these things changed it, how do they see it? Because they'll be impacted the most at the end of it.
Yeah.
So we can workshop that whole procedure and the rubric and things like that. But would it be a priority to get this split as a first step so that even if we don't get the procedure unloaded for the first intake, we are able to split the pot evenly? Because it might take us some time to do the research and enroll that new procedure. We might be limited to be using the old procedure for at least early intake. The only thing that I think would be essential to change first would to be not give out 70% of it. And then we could still enroll our stuff for the next intake. It would give us 6 months to workshop it.
Yeah, and I think if the committee's in favor of, you know, doing this equal split, that's easily passed by resolution and we can get a report in early October. I think some of the process changes we probably could roll out. Ideally, it would be nice to have consistency in how we handle all of the 2025 intake together. But I do think that, you know, that process could also then, you know, those would be the main points that are discussed at the next CVC meeting. And we'd have a little bit of time to fine tune that process through October and into November when we start deliberations later on. So that would give us some time in between to look at how, because we have the flexibility to do those, how we're doing the allocations. It's just if we're changing amounts, dates, those types of things, we need to make sure we update the policy.
I'm going to sneeze. Excuse me.
That's good to know. It gives us an idea of what can move forward and what really needs to be workshopped. And, you know, we might not have the option to. I would love to enroll the whole thing at once if we could.
I think we can. We got a great committee.
So
Yeah.
Honestly, I think that we're a lot farther ahead than I anticipated. So, you know, that was a lot of time and effort that went into that, Brenna, and, you know, I really appreciate that. It gave us a really great point to start this discussion today. And I think we've, you know, come up with some really good actionable steps to take forward to the committee in September.
if I'm being honest, I expected to be taking some feedback today from the conversation and then developing something on my own and presenting it. So thank you so much for taking these first steps. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you for allowing me. This is how I brain dump. So very good. I gotta get it out. I gotta understand it. So I'm glad it's helpful for more than just me.
This also makes it easier to come back to the guidelines and really pare them down based on how they're serving the process. Mm-hmm.
So at this time, we'd like to recommend the CVC ultimately that we'd like to split the allocated amount into 2 different intakes evenly. Is there anything else that I'm missing here? Because as we're looking to keep our timeline the same, but to continue our work in the next couple of weeks and see how we can get this move forward very soon. But ultimately, is there a need to call a CVC meeting prior to September 12th, Virginia? Because just looking at the calendar, and I don't mind sharing with this, we have the Vivid Festival coming up the 20th, 21st, 22nd, and some other city events and commitments that are around that time as well. Normally we'd be scheduled for Wednesday, the 18th, but to meet that council meeting on the 12th, we'd have to have this go immediately. We'd have to have this ready to go immediately, basically, to be able to hit the agenda. So what are your thoughts?
I'm just looking at the date for we could probably take it to council on October 1st.
Okay.
That still gives a full month. We're not necessarily changing the application. right? And we're not making too many changes to it. So I think as long as, yeah, I think we're fine to try to schedule something the week, like in mid-September.
Okay.
October 1st, my deadline will be, I'm just backing up.
Because I don't see it happening on Wednesday, the 18th. Again, based on other departmental commitments that are happening that evening.
Yeah, my report would be due on the 18th. So if we try to hopefully have something the week of the 9th. And then that way that would give us a few days to write the report and get it onto the council agenda for October 1st.
All right. And so sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, that's good.
Okay. And so at this point in time, we're just looking to equalize those intakes. And there's nothing further going forward at this moment. And we can continue to work it in the next couple of weeks. Yes. Okay, great. I just want to make sure I didn't miss anything because I'm going to be writing that agenda soon. So that was really great. Thank you very much for both being such engaged committee members. I appreciate it. So I think that we should probably plan to meet again at some point. I was gonna say with some, yeah, I don't know when when would make sense. We can come back to that. I was gonna say that. Is it okay if we move to adjourn at this point? And I'll let you have your day back. Please, if I could have a mover, please. Okay, Miranda to move and Brett to second that one. All right. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
This was great.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a good day.